She's going to give a handout. Ran out. Or there's some more
No,
over
there should be some. There's
some more on the other side. You need that one?
No, I don't need it.
Sure.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. This is a committee meeting to discuss the property located at 429 North State Street. I have today in attendance Councilor Carney, Councilor Driscoll, Councilor Green, Councilor Thompson, President Hudson, Councilor Bay, and myself, Councilor Allen. And we have Kate here to speak. Would you just give us kind of I'm assuming a lot of people have received phone calls. I know I have. I received phone calls, emails, and some in-person conversations about this particular project. So if you would just give a brief overview of what's going on. And although this isn't a public hearing, and we don't normally, you guys ready? Yeah, ready? Okay. Yeah. We don't normally, it's not a public hearing, so normally we won't have a whole bunch of people speaking, but this is a very important issue to the people that live in the neighborhood, so I do want to allow some time for some people to come up to the microphone. If we can just leave it to about 2 minutes, that would be ideal. Okay. All right, thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Councilor Allen and council members. Thank you very much for holding this committee meeting. So what I wanted to start with was just a
Could you pull the mic up a little bit more, Kate? Sorry, it's not really. You guys hear it?
Pull it up from the base.
Okay.
Towards you.
Yeah, there you okay. There. Good. Okay. So what I wanted to do was to start with just an explanation of the procedure, which and what the Landmark Preservation Board was looking at in terms of making its determination and recommendation that this be that 429 North State Street be designated a local protected site. What triggered this recommendation to designate this property was that the property owner earlier this year informed the Landmark Preservation Board that he proposed to demolish the property for a new development project. Because the property is on the city's historic properties list, the demolition request triggered a provision of the zoning ordinance that gives the community the opportunity to determine whether a property that is slated for demolition should be considered for designation and possible protection. This provision was added to the preservation ordinance after a number of unfortunate demolitions anyway, so as it is laid out in the preservation ordinance, in order to designate a local protected site, a property must possess one of the following characteristics. It has to have an association with persons or events of historic significance to the city, region, state, or nation. It has to be illustrative of the historic growth and development of the city, region, state, or nation. It should embody distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or represent the work of a master, or possess unique architectural or artistic qualities. And then there are two other criteria, one in regard to districts and another in regard to interiors, and neither of those applied in this particular circumstance. So the LPB, the Landmark Preservation Board, held a public hearing on July 18th and heard testimony and was presented with documentation about the property, and you have in front of you the local protected site application. Based upon the review of the materials and testimony, the board determined that the building met 3, and remember it only needs to meet one of those criteria, but 3 out of the 5 criteria. Criterion 1, for its association with persons of historic significance to the city, specifically Angelo Row and the Angelo Row family. Criterion 2, for its association with the historic growth and development of the city, specifically its association with the early 20th century immigrant history, Italian immigrant history in particular, as well as the city's brewing history. And Criterion 3, for its architecture. It remains an excellent example of early 20th century architecture, retaining integrity of location, design, setting, materials, and workmanship, feeling, and association. So after the public hearing, the board voted unanimously to recommend that 429 North State Street be designated a local protected site. And the next stage in the process was to send it to the Planning Commission. Planning Commission held its public hearing on October 7th, and it too voted unanimously to move this petition to the Common Council for a final vote. Let's see, do you have I could go into some detail about the history of the property, or
So we can. I'm going to open it up for questions from my colleagues first, and then if it touches on that, then you can kind of explain more.
Yeah.
Okay. Councilor Carney?
So I was actually at the Planning Commission meeting and sat in and listened to a lot of the neighbors get up and speak. But I guess I'm just a little bit curious. Do we know what the plan, like what's the purpose of demolishing it? Like did we lose a tenant in the building, or is it, or what's the plan that they actually have? Because, I understand, I'm sort of divided, at times I think, geez, you want to let a property owner do what they want with the property, but we just demolish so many of these historic properties in the city time and time again when maybe it's not necessary. I mean, when there's a property that's condemned, obviously it needs to come down, but I'm just sort of curious as to what the actual plan is by the property owner, developer, whoever's doing the work.
So there was I think a pre-development meeting for this property, and the proposal, what my understanding is, the proposal is to demolish the property. There are a couple vacant lots next door, and the idea is to construct a new mixed-use development that would include a restaurant or commercial uses on the ground floor and apartment units above. This actually is the current configuration of the building that's there right now in that corner.
Yeah.
So that is the proposal.
I was curious what I spoke to the developer just before the meeting, Mr. Marcosio, and he was kind of presenting it like he was told it wasn't important to attend. I mean, for me, in making these decisions, with Councilor Carney, I'd like to hear both sides, and I'm just wondering if that was made clear to him that we'd like him to present and he declined, or did we not want him to present, or his team, Sheila or whoever, to present? Because I would just like to hear both sides when making, you know what I mean, when making the educated, informed decision about. Sure. Because for me, I think, we've heard there's a lot of constituents here who have voiced their concerns, saying they want to preserve this. Obviously, the Preservation Board has deemed it a historic site. I don't dispute that at all. But with Councilor Carney's addressing is, I know he's put out figures of 10 million plus investment in this corridor of new housing, new units, et cetera, et cetera. Not to push back on the historic aspect of it at all, but it feels rather incomplete to analyze the situation for me without having their presentation as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I'd like to know if they want to demolish it, why do they want to demolish it? What's the need? I've heard conversation about incorporating the current building into his vision of the area. That, I think, would be the ideal situation from the council's perspective, to keep the historic building and to have him build in the lots around it. If he could do that in a way that was, but yeah, I was just curious what the conversation was with the development team, and if they were in fact told it wasn't important for them to be here, or if they declined to be here.
You know what, I can't answer that. I certainly did not, no one on the Landmark Preservation Board or myself would have told them not to come to this committee meeting. It was a request from the Landmark Preservation Board to hold the committee meeting. I can tell you from the presentation from his architect at both the Preservation Board's public hearing as well as at the Planning Commission's meeting, that they are interested in incorporating parking into the development and were concerned they would not be able to do so if the building was still there. But, you know, beyond that, you know, I can't speak for the developer. They were not discouraged from coming.
Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay, so I'm going to open it up just for a few comments, if you will. I know there's about 3 people that wanted to speak, so if you can you approach the microphone? That's it.
Thank you, councilors.
Just a reminder for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I'll do my very best. Those of you who know me. I just want to pick up on Joe's question relative to the participation of the owner. The owner had all the ability to come to the pre-meeting for his project at the Landmark Board and to the review of the property at the Landmark Board. He also had the right, to come to the Planning Commission presentation and speak, and he did not. But that was all open to him. His architect spoke for his intentions. I think it's interesting that he would that it would be thought that this would be the place for an owner to come up and make their case. That seems inappropriate to the process of accurate review of all of the experts in place. I would like to speak in support of the Landmark President. I'm sorry, Bob Haley, 137 Buckingham Avenue, Syracuse, for almost 50 years now. Landmark Preservation Board Vice Chair for the past 23 years. I'd like to speak, first of all, we're happy to be here at this chair, at your table. We believe that the purpose of the Landmark Preservation is to support the treasures and the historic value of construction, quality, and history, whether it's personal history or quality of an era. This building, the Angelo Row building, I wish George Angelo Row were here to speak, because that's the best, the great-grandson of the builder. The building is really met all of the criteria, 3 of the criteria, a significance, a building in the history of the development of the city of Syracuse, located where it was, along just above the Oswego Canal, connected to the Erie Canal in terms of immigrants coming into the country. Also, the Tide House, which was the relationship between a building and an owner of an apartment building to put in a Tide House to align with one of the breweries in Syracuse and make the first floor the Bartels or the Congress, and all of the interior and the bar and the eloquence that goes with what we see in these old period bar rooms came from the bar who set up, just like in England, the long tradition of bars, of the pubs putting in the money for the fancy walnut bars and the mirrors and everything else went in. This had all that in it. Plus the fact that Mr. Angelo also supported the Italian immigrants coming here, and until they got established, they lived in the apartment building above until they found local jobs and developed their own houses and properties. I'm going to stop here, but what I would like to do too is to say that the Landmark Board wants to carry the intellectual capital and historic capital of our past to your table, so that we can share the goals of preserving historic buildings. This one meets the qualifications. I don't want to be negative, but this particular developer, and to answer your question, yes, the building is in the place where they had an entrance to a parking garage in their scheme. That can be solved by another scheme. You can look at other ways to get into the garage. It might make it a little more difficult. They might not want to maintain an older building or include an older building in their project. But those are all things that could be solved through appropriate development if this building is designated as important to the city of Syracuse. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haley. So is it my understanding, if I could just follow up on Mr. Haley's point, that traditionally having the other party at a landmark preservation meeting is not typical protocol or recommended protocol?
No, they are always invited, and they're absolutely. The property owner is notified, and I have documentation of that request.
Okay, so he's been invited repeatedly and not shown up. I just want to make sure.
Well, at the planning commission,
Sheila showed up. Sheila Weed showed up.
And may I say that the architect also spoke for him at the preservation board meeting as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
so his team has come to everything, and they were aware of this meeting. I'm just sorry. I hate to harp on this. I'm just trying to clarify whether.
Well, I mean, it's a public meeting, so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to trying to clarify. Sorry.
And I guess my point is just simply that, we're another step in this process, and it is frustrating and difficult to try and make a decision when one party doesn't show up to this step in it. And I know there's 2 other steps before you get to us, but
Sure.
we're the third and final step, and
Yep.
you'd
It's
like
very-
to at least hear their argument as to why. Because in all honesty, just gut reaction, it's a historic district. It's a historic building in my district that
Right.
is in use right now. So it's sort of difficult to say, why would we tear something down that's already in use?
I understand.
We'd like to hear from the person trying to develop it to say, why are you actually going to?
A very good point. In the process, the owner of the property can pick, either come himself, speak to his case, which frequently is done by owners of buildings, or pick their representative, could be a lawyer, could be an architect, to come and make their case. He did not show up at that. I will say one other thing. There is some, I won't say any more.
Okay.
Sorry,
All
thank you,
right,
Mr.
thank
Haley.
you.
And I didn't mean to nitpick. I'm just trying to clarify exactly.
All right, go ahead.
Understand the situation fully.
Good morning. My name is Jonathan Link Logan. I'm the program director for Northside Up, which is part of Center State CEO's efforts to help revitalize the North Side. I prepared a statement that I think you all should have received that I shared around, but I wanted to read a portion of that. With the loss of 4 historic buildings within the North Salina National Historic District in August of 2018, it would be a shame to lose another historic building. In addition to the fire, other instances of unnecessary demolition and property disinvestment have contributed to an erosion of our historic fabric that we must guard against. This is particularly concerning at a time when Northside Up and its neighborhood partners have spent over the last decade working to leverage many of the historic buildings of the North Side as part of its neighborhood revitalization efforts. We are not alone in our belief that historic properties, such as the one in question, can be a strong foundation for successful neighborhood reinvestment. Other communities, and indeed other neighborhoods in the city of Syracuse, are leveraging their historic assets as a foundation of successful revitalization efforts. In a number of instances, historic structures are incorporated into the proposed new development, preserving the building. A recent local example of the blending of new and historic development is the Sylvester Building project on the corner of Irving and Fayette Streets. The former Red House, Pike Block, Sky Armory, CNY Philanthropy Center, Amos Building expansion, Citronelle, and the Landmark Theater addition are other local examples. While the developer asserts that this building has outlived its purposes, we see it differently, as these other projects are examples of historic buildings finding new purposes. These projects set a tone for what we as a community value in our development projects, helping to attract visitors to our neighborhoods to experience its historic architecture. They also indicate to the future developers the types of creative, thoughtful projects we wish to see, ones that build on our history while simultaneously allowing for progress. Northside Up and its partners worked with developers of the Dunkin' Donuts project to create one that met the needs of both parties. We stand ready to work with this developer to create a successful project on the site, one that incorporates the historic existing structure while searching for creative ways to implement transformational project that increases property and sales taxes. We strongly urge you to designate this as a local protected site.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I got you guys on a timer. You're okay. I had to let you get an extra 12 seconds since Mr. Haley took about an extra 2 minutes. Okay, it's okay.
I'll make up the time for you,
All right,
LaToya.
you
I'll
ready?
be short and sweet.
All
I'm
right, ready, set, go.
Okay. I'm Andrea Wanda. I'm the executive director of NIDA, 101 Gertrude Street, Syracuse. I also reside in Eastwood at 139 Cook Avenue. And I'm the secretary of the Northside Business Partnership. So I'm here on behalf of NIDA and the Northside Business Partnership. Honestly, Jonathan said, 98% of what I would want to say to you. But the Northside Business Partnership and the board at NIDA both have very strong concerns about the loss of historic buildings on the north side. We feel the North Salina corridor is one of our community's great treasures, and we want to do whatever we can to help maintain them. And yes, we'd be more than happy to work with the developer on solutions to help meet the goals of both parties. So thank you so much for your consideration, and look how well I did.
I know, you gave Grant an extra minute and 7 seconds.
I won't even need it. So I'm Grant Johnson. I'm the president of the board of directors of the Preservation Association of Central New York. I also reside at 120 Miles Avenue in the Westcott neighborhood, which is where some of the counselors have dealt with me before, because I'm also the president of the Westcott Neighborhood Association. But that is tangential to this meeting. So thank you, Councilor Allen, for holding this meeting, and all the councilors for attending, including the youngest councilor who is present here today. Jonathan also stole some of the things I was going to say. But one of the things he didn't mention with regard to the precedents for reuse of historic buildings like the Sylvester building, Day Brothers, et cetera, is that those projects leveraged historic tax credits, both state and federal, which would potentially be available to this building were it incorporated into some sort of new development next to it. The idea here, in my mind, is not to halt progress and leave the Angelo Row building as an island, this memento to history that's surrounded by nothingness. No, the streetscape should be filled in, and jobs should be created, and new businesses, and that corridor should be revitalized. And Packney and myself, and probably many others, see the Angelo Row building as a potential catalyst, not an anchor to that neighborhood, anchor in a negative sense, not in a positive sense. But there's just a lot of opportunity here for that building and that whole corridor to be revitalized, and designating the building a local protected site is an important step so that the historic characteristics can be preserved and it can move forward as a potential tax credit project, and the history of the building and the neighborhood is honored. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Come up to the mic, please, Bob.
Sorry. In the process, this designation is important. Simply, one of the primary reasons for designation is to document the accurate history. This guy's tall, isn't he?
Most of us.
And therefore, the designation process is important to document the history and the quality or the period or whatever the designating characteristics are. That does not mean the building may stand up forever. The applicant can come back with a request for appropriateness for demolition and make a case for demolishing a building that has been designated. Am I correct on that? Quite correct?
Yeah, I think, sure.
Yeah, so there is process ahead after designation. So what I'm trying to say here is that the designation documents the history from this review process, bringing back all the history, bringing everything forward, and then you vote on that to put that into the archives of the city of Syracuse for the people and for the place. That the applicant then can come back with still make an application for demolition or change the project in some way and have that reviewed. And also at the Landmark Board, they get support in how other ways to achieve the goal of their project and maintain the building. So there's a lot going on of advice to an owner or developer to use the resources that are deemed valuable. So it's not the end of the process. Is that correct, Kate?
That is correct.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. If there's no further, you have a question?
Yes, two.
Yeah, use your mic.
First one. Thank you. First question. When I know the Angelo Row family had the building. It's not owned by them any longer, correct?
That's correct.
So when the current owner purchased the property, what did they purchase this as? Was it at the time that they bought it? Did they think that they could demolish it and use this in another fashion, or was it already protected?
No, it was not protected. I believe it was almost certainly on, I would have to see how long Mr. Mercosha has owned the property, but it has been on the historic properties list for quite some time as eligible for the National Register and eligible for local designation.
Okay. So say he's owned it, I don't know, maybe 15 years, something like 15 years ago.
Yeah, I would anticipate that the building, that it's not new to the list.
Okay.
Yeah.
And my second question is maybe there's somebody from administration can answer this. What development mind, there really hasn't been anything done up there in quite some time. The Nettleton building was done. And then there hasn't been anything that's gone on in that corridor for a number of years. The next block down, where the Vietnamese restaurant was, that I think recently closed, and then there's an apartment complex that's been there. That's a beautiful complex that I think Robert De Niro actually lived in or was at one time in his life. And so I'm trying to put this together in my mind. We've got the back end of St. Joe's, which doesn't help out for development at all. But where's our vision? What are we looking at? And is this just
Sharon Owens, Deputy Mayor, City of Syracuse. to many of the points here, it's a complex question. To the points of many people here, the north side, particularly the South Salina corridor, is populated with rich, old, historic buildings that add to its character. The vision of the administration regarding development is absolutely infill to maintain density where it is appropriate. The proposed use by way of, I wasn't at either one of the meetings, but the proposed use of mixed-use retail and residency is along the lines of what we're looking for in the city of Syracuse. The question becomes whether or not we believe that building should be designated. Thank you for also adding the fact that designation doesn't stop demolition in the future if possible, or if necessary. And I agree with the counselors. It is important for you to hear from the perspective of both sides on this topic. But as far as the infill, proposed infill, the proposed use is in line with what we're looking for. Did that
Do you mind
answer?
if I ask a follow-up question to that?
Sure.
So, to me, when I look at the city, I think the north side and that Salina Street corridor is the place where there's the most unrealized potential. And I think that because when I walk down the street, the architecture is so awesome, right?
Absolutely.
And so to me, when I envision what we want that neighborhood to be in the next couple decades, it would be more vibrant, there'd be more people, but it would be tying in the historic architecture, and that would be the competitive advantage of that neighborhood, is the historical nature of it.
It has its own character.
Is that the vision of the administration as well?
Absolutely. Each neighborhood in this community has its own particular footprint, and that's what makes Syracuse special. What that is in the north side is absolutely the architecture of the buildings. And to be able to have better use of the existing buildings, opportunities for improved restoration of them, variety of amenities in them is absolutely important to that neighborhood.
So my question is relative to the apartments, that the complex that's attached, the row homes that are attached.
Right.
Do we have any knowledge as to what, anybody working on these? Is there anything going on with them at this point?
I don't, but I can follow up. I was looking for anybody from NBD, but they're not here.
So the apartment building that you're referencing, it's owned by Cosmos Evaglia, and I think within the past 5 years or so, he's completely renovated it. It had sat vacant for quite some time, and so it's now occupied again for the first time in several years.
I'm assuming that part of the reason for the owner wanting to demolish the structures probably related to cost for renovation.
I think it may be cost. Let's face it, it's simpler just to have a clean slate.
Yeah, it is.
Demolition does cost also, though. There's a cost associated with that. Yeah.
Right, but not the same cost if you likely go inside the walls and find ultimately what he and any other person probably would expect. I'm just asking a question. I'm not making any suggestion in either direction with that by asking that question. Is it known whether he sought any kind of support for upfront costs? Is it known whether he sought any kind of tax breaks or any kind of...
I believe it's still very early in the planning stages. I believe what was presented at the pre-development meeting was really, as I said, it was a pre-development meeting, just conceptual drawings. Is that, Owen, is that your recollection of
Yes,
that?
that's fairly accurate, yeah. I was at
Were
a
you
bunch,
there?
yeah, I
You
was
were
at
there?
some of the pre-production.
Anybody in the administration aware of whether he sought any kind of, I mean, I understand that you're saying it's early, but anybody aware of any discussion he may have had about?
We're not, and I'll find out if anybody knows.
Okay.
Heather is back there too. She was shaking her
I
head.
think I was with the...
Said no?
Yeah, I've been talking to him closely, Council, but I don't think he's sought any funding yet. I think he's wants to, another issue with this property was depending on which option we went with for 81, it's in that they were concerned that it would be within the footprint of changes that were made with the community grid or with the viaduct, depending on which option we went with. So they were also waiting for that. So I think they're definitely they haven't started looking for funding yet because they're waiting to resolve the historical issue and the
Okay, that makes sense.
and the 81 issue, which they have resolved. It won't be affected by whichever option we go with.
Is the building functioning now? Is it still open as a restaurant?
It's
Yes.
still open as a restaurant. That's correct. I don't know if there are people living up above, but it is there's a Mexican restaurant in the ground floor.
Very good margaritas and sangria.
Alrighty.
Yep.
Can I ask a question? I just have one more. So.
But they win awards for the others.
So to address Councilor Bay's point about a clean slate, and I'm not in the weeds on tax credits and how that would all work historically. Is there an argument to be made that would the possible money up front, like, would the tax credits apply to the whole development if it would just be for that one building?
It would just be for the historic piece, but it is a 40% tax credit, and it's in recognition that when you are working with historic properties, that your costs may be higher because but there's a recognition that in doing this, there is a value in doing this, and the government has come up with this program to help defray those additional costs for the greater good of being able to preserve a historic property and reuse it.
Yeah, I would just be curious to have some sense of cost analysis. Obviously, often developers in this situation will say that if they can't have their way, then they'll walk away, which is obviously just a tactic to try to get the lowest, but it does actually, to some of the points of the administration and to Councilor Green's point about how cost prohibitive this would be in his development, because I think as the council, we obviously, speaking for myself, seeing $10 million invested in that corridor is a very promising concept. I think, like Councilor Green was saying, it's untapped potential in that corridor. So I think, ideally, I'd love to, it'd be great to have both, but I'd be curious to know how much additional cost will be estimated to the developer with this being kept in, or how much the tax credit offsets that, et cetera, you know what I mean?
And so what I would say is that actually it feels as though we're getting ahead of ourselves, because really the issue at hand is, does this property merit designation? It's valuable to know that, as Bob just said, that designation in itself is not as though then the building is set in amber. That the job of the Landmark Preservation Board is to help manage change over time. And that could mean selective demolition. That could mean if there is an appeals process through the Landmark Preservation Board, that if he came with saying that the costs were too prohibitive to do XYZ, that could be appealed to the Landmark Preservation Board, and if the Landmark Preservation Board denied that application, they could go to the Planning Commission that has.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a process.
He goes to the Planning
It is not the end of the whole thing, but again, the what is before you now
is this a historical building?
Is it a historic building worthy of
preservation,
protection, of designation, and an additional consideration?
I was just going to say that I'm an admitted fan of new development, but at the same time, I've seen some phenomenal projects on properties that's been preserved. Certainly, the ones mentioned, the Sylvester Building for sure. So you can see the value. I've a number of us have witnessed it inside and outside. The things that have been done with historic properties, even when they had extensions added to them. So you see the value there. I just wanted to state that I agree with what's been mentioned. about at least having perspective from the developer, but also want to make clear, I'm sorry, I'll speak for myself. I'm certainly not one to ignore the concerns of the people who live closest to it, and not ignore the interests of the district council they represented, that they elected. So, speaking for myself, those will be factors for me for determining what I do in terms of a vote. But at least if we can get, I don't know if we can get anything soon or any kind of communication soon from developer just to give us some additional perspective. I think that'll help at least myself make a more informed decision.
Could we?
There was a comment earlier about this being the back end of St. Joe's, and I would use a harsher term, I think, if I were really describing it, what they kind of did to State Street, which caused, so you've got this island of the building that's left. When was and I would assume that the street originally had similar kind of buildings on both sides. So when was the last time, do you have any idea when the last time one of them was torn down, since we kind of have the one remaining one?
On that block of North State Street. Actually, I'm going to defer to Jonathan again.
So Mr. Markosha owns the properties that go from this building all the way over to the eastern edge of the block where the Zipper building is. And there were two other structures on those properties that were demolished since the time I've been here working on the north side, so within the last decade, during a time frame that he owned those buildings as well. And they were never really in great shape. And so that's the time frame of the last buildings on that block being demolished by him as the owner.
Can you go in one more time to a little bit? So, were you done, Councilor Rudd?
Yeah.
So what were the three criteria again that it met?
I'll refer back to my notes.
Yeah, because before we went to comments and questions, you were about to present some more of the
I was just going to
tactical
talk a
arguments
little bit
on-
more about the history of the
Yeah,
property.
yeah, let's hear
And would you like to?
Is that okay with the other councilors? Yeah.
So the Angelo Row building was constructed in 1904 by Angelo Row. He immigrated to Syracuse from Italy in the 1890s. Angelo Row was in the first wave of Italian immigrants to arrive in the city and who settled in what would become known later as Little Italy on the city's north side. Angelo Row was a successful businessman. He owned and built several properties, including this property and the other Angelo Row building, which is actually located on Pearl Street, also named Angelo Row, you'll see, which is at the corner of Pearl and Belden, and backs up onto this one. When it was constructed, 429 North State Street housed, so actually it has always housed some type of saloon or restaurant on the ground floor, and apartments on the upper floors. According to the family history, Angelo Row helped new Italian immigrants as they came into the city. Helped them get a foothold in the community. They rented the upstairs space. He also had, for example, a bank down on the ground floor that he operated to help the tenants. So in providing them lodging and connections to job opportunities. So in addition to its association with this immigrant history and the Angelo Row family. It also has important associations to the Syracuse's brewing history. It's possibly one of the only remaining sample houses, or tied, as in you are tied to something, tied house, for the Bartels Brewing Company. Bartels was a major local brewery that helped bring Syracuse to regional prominence in the beer brewing industry from the late 19th century into Prohibition. As a sample house, only Bartels products would have been sold at the saloon, and the company most likely had a hand in the construction of the saloon, if not the building itself. If you look, I believe there's a picture of it in your packet too. There's a beer barrel with the date of the property on the front facade, and that relates to this history, this brewing history. So and also in that package, you'll see that there's a early 20th century image of the building that shows the property looking very much like it does today, and it is, as I said, noted as an excellent example of the early 20th century commercial architecture with a high degree of architectural integrity. One of the striking features of this building, unusual to this area, is its yellow brick facade, which does make it quite distinct. It stands out, and it would have been built that way to stand out amongst all that red brick that you see on North Salina Street, for example. And one of the other things is that it has, it's probably one of the reasons it has retained its good integrity is because it really has, the uses have not changed. It was built as a restaurant or a saloon on the ground floor with apartments above. That's how it is today as well. And our understanding is that, and again, the developer's not here to confirm this, but from the testimony from his architect, we understand that that is in fact what they're hoping to do again in this corner, is to have a restaurant and have apartments up above. So we would hope, the Landmark Preservation Board would hope that the Common Council would vote to designate this so that we could help find ways for him to incorporate this building into a new development.
Okay. Thank you. Yep.
So the building is structurally sound?
Yes.
So he just wants to demo it to move it out the way to start over. So there's
that. I mean, that is my understanding, and it is a complicated site in that it is a fairly steep. There's a fairly steep slope, but I can't say that every option or alternative has been considered in terms of what could happen with this property. So. But I don't believe it is the condition of the property that would bring it down, that would merit it just on an emergency demolition or such.
Okay. All right. I was going to allow Councilor Carney to have the closing comments, but since he's away, I think we're all set here if there's no further questions. All right.
Thank you very much
Thank
for your
you.
time.
Oh.